How's it going out there, music maker? My name's Griffin, and in today's lesson, I'm going to be showing you the chords to the classic swing tune, Sweet Georgia Brown. If you haven't had a chance already, we did a lesson on the melody to this one, so you'll want to go over to the Mandolin Secrets channel and bookmark that one right now. Before we go ahead and dive into today's lesson, though, if you haven't had a chance, hit that subscribe button below and the bell notification button. That way you'll get notified whenever we upload a new lesson here to the Mandolin Secrets channel. Also, if you're interested in a more enhanced lesson with things like PDFs of the sheet music and tablature for the chords today, or things like backing tracks and play-alongs, and access to our community of mandolin players just like you, click that link below in the description to Mandolin Secrets Academy. There you'll find all sorts of goodies and information on how to sign up. All right, my friend, in today's lesson, I'm going to be showing you some really standard chord shapes that don't just apply here to the tune Sweet Georgia Brown, but are really good chord shapes to know in general for navigating your way through some swing mandolin playing. One of the neat concepts that we're going to talk about today is the tritone and how you can kind of monitor this shape inside of your chord shapes to kind of navigate through what I like to call a chain of secondary dominance. That's actually the kind of bulk of the chord changes in Sweet Georgia Brown aren't actually in the key of the tune. Kind of crazy, right? The tune is in the key of F, which is a pretty common key to play this tune in, but we actually start on a D7 chord, totally not in the key of F. If you were to build a chord starting on a D note in the key of F, you would end up with a D minor 7 chord. But here we're using a D dominant 7 chord, which we can kind of view as a, what would you call it? A 5 of 2 chord in the key of F. So your 2 chord in the key of F is a G, the 5th of G is a D note, and we're on a D7th chord. So it's a 5 chord written as a Roman numeral 5 / 2, lowercase Roman numeral 2. So that's kind of, it's a little confusing if you're not familiar with the concept of secondary dominance, but the easiest way to think about it is we're kind of just creating a chain of dominant 7th chords that really steer the listener's ear to the next chord resolution. That's the whole point of a 5 dominant 7 chord. It's kind of like the most catalytic chord that exists in Western tonal music here that we're playing. So the 5 dominant 7 chord really steers that listener's ear toward a 5-1 resolution. So just for example, the 5 chord in the key of F, F, G, A, B flat, C, would be a C7 chord. So the shape that we're using for our C7 chord here today is this, what I like to call the V chord shape, because it makes a little V if you look at my left hand. Now this is one of the main dominant 7th chord shapes that we're going to be using today. Also for our D7 chord, if you move it up 2 frets, it's a D7. Listen to this. Doesn't that just sound really like what I want to say, pleasurable, and like we've kind of landed in a resting place, right? So that 5 chord really wants to steer your ear back to that 1 chord, the F chord that I'm playing here. So to get back to what I was saying about secondary dominance, we're just creating a chain of what I would call, you know, secondary dominance or artificial 5 chords to move us perpetually toward that 1 chord. One interesting thing, if you look at the chord changes to Sweet Georgia Brown, it actually moves us backwards around the circle of fifths. We're starting on a D chord, goes to a G chord, goes to a C chord, goes to an F chord. So if you look up a circle of fifths, you'll see that the chord changes just kind of trace the outline of that because it's all 5-1 motion perpetually. I always find that to be one of the most interesting thing about not just this tune in general, but kind of jazz music in general. Really exploits that concept. So in today's tune, let's review these chord shapes that we're going to be using for our secondary dominance to get us through the chord changes to Sweet Georgia Brown. I already showed you that V shape that we're using for the D7 chord here. So we've got our middle finger on the 5th fret of the G, index 4th fret of D, and then ring finger on the 5th fret of A. And to get our G7 chord, we actually just take these two fingers, our index and middle, and move them down a fret. So it's, if we're doing fret numbers from the bottom string to the top, it's 4, 3, 5. And you may notice, if you've got a little bit of fretboard knowledge here, that there's actually no G note in this G7 chord. But how can we tell it's a G7 chord? Because of the bottom two notes. The 3rd and the 7th in any kind of 7th chord are the two most important notes, not the root actually, to tell us what chord quality we're working with here. So these bottom two notes, B and F, B is the 3rd, F is our dominant 7th here, and then we've got our 5th on top. So that's our G7 shape. Our C7 we already reviewed, it's that V shape, so we just kind of take these two fingers, move them down a fret, and then put our ring finger on the 3rd fret. So fret numbers once again, 3, 2, 3. And then for our F6 chord, I've chosen to go with this inversion. We've got 2, 3, 5. So we've got our 3rd, our root, and our 6th. Now you may notice too, when I play a D minor chord in the second half of the tune, I'm also using this same shape. For those of you out there that have a bit of music theory behind you, you'll know that an F6 chord is in fact the exact same notes as a D minor 7 chord. So you can use those two chords interchangeably. We just view different notes in those inversions as the root. So when it's an F chord, that note is the root. And when it's a D minor chord, that note is the root. I know that may seem confusing, but because the mandolin has a limited number of strings, we don't have 6 like the guitar, sometimes we have to recycle inversions like this. And I think it's kind of a neat harmonic device to be able to use the same inversion for 2 different chords. That way you only have to memorize 1 chord, right? So that's our D minor chord that we're going to be using. The A7 chord that we're using in the changes here today, we keep that index finger on the 2nd fret, pinky on the 5th fret of D, ring on the 4th fret of A. So that's our A7 chord here today. And then the last kind of 4 bars of the tune here, we have the most rapid harmonic motion out of the entire tune. The chords change every 2 beats, and it's kind of like a descending chain to get us back to the root chord, the F chord. So I kind of choose this F chord to start us out on that chain. It's index finger on the 5th of G, ring finger on the 7th of D, and then pinky on the 8th of A. So there's your F, and then we just use that V shape for our E chord, E7 that is. So that would be 7, 6, 7. Then we play an E flat 7. Just move it down a half step. Another half step down to D. Use our same G7 shape. C7. And then F6. So to play that in context one more time, those last 4 bars of the chord changes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you might want to pause the video now and review some of those chord changes, because we're going to need all of them, and that's a lot that I just threw at you there. But if you think you're ready and you've got those chord changes down, there's something interesting I want to talk about regarding just kind of the first half of this tune. We'll just kind of use that as an example here. I mentioned at the top of this video that we can kind of view one shape in all of our chord changes to kind of string all of them together. And if you're familiar with the kind of music theory term, the tritone, it's a diminished 5th or an augmented 4th interval. This is what it looks like on the mandolin. You might recognize that because it's just the bottom half of our D7 chord, right? But the distance between a C and an F sharp is a tritone. Now, if you look, when we move between our D7 and our G7 chord, that tritone just moves down a half step. And then when we move from our G7 chord to our C7 chord, that tritone moves down another half step. And something really cool about the tritone is it's kind of like the most catalytic musical interval. And what I mean by that is it kind of sparks harmonic motion. Every time you hear a tritone, it wants to resolve this way into our F chord. So we end up on a B flat and an E, which is our 7th respectively, and our 3rd. And there's this kind of music theory rule that when you have a tritone, the 7th of your chord will resolve down by a half step into the 3rd of your 1 chord. And the 3rd of your tritone will kind of resolve up by a half step into the root of your 1 chord. So at the same time again. So it's this really satisfying kind of landing on the 1 chord as a result of those chain of tritones. So what's cool, just to kind of tie all of this together, if you've got a chord progression that works its way around the circle of fifths backwards, you can find the tritone, the interval between the 3rd and the 7th of your dominant 7th chord. And if you're doing a circle of fifths progression that back cycles through the circle of fifths, you can almost just use those 2 notes and descend by half steps until you get to your 1 chord, and then you'll need to make that resolution that I just talked about. So I find this to be a really fascinating kind of music theory tool, rather. And I hope that you'll find that fascinating as well. If you find it to be confusing right now, that's probably just because you don't have a lot of music theory behind you, or at least enough to understand that concept. Where I would start is just kind of looking up the tritone as a musical interval online, and then seeing how either classical or jazz musicians like to resolve those tritones. That's really the kind of key to understanding this concept. All right, my friend, that's enough of that musical theory mumbo jumbo. Let's go ahead and actually get to playing the chord changes to this tune. Queued up here first, I've got a version of the chord changes at 100 beats per minute on Sweet Georgia Brown. That's a good tempo to kind of get these chord changes underneath of us and get our bearings, and then I'll ratchet that tempo up to 160 beats per minute. Just to be clear on what we're doing in the right hand too, it's all downstrokes played as quarter notes for each measure of music. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a real common way to phrase swing rhythm. I like to call it the Freddie Green style, after the famous jazz guitar player for Count Basie's orchestra, Freddie Green, who that was kind of his landmark, or what do I want to say, his kind of typical style that he phrased his chord inversions in when playing with the orchestra. It's also really common to do that in Western swing with, slight different phrasing, and the same for gypsy jazz. Still quarter notes, but maybe a slight different articulation. So this is a good entry point into a lot of jazz styles. All right, my friend, let's dive into those chord changes at 100 beats per minute. Okay, music maker, how do you feel about that? If you still feel a little shaky, feel free to pause this video, rewind a bit, and use that gear icon below to slow the video down to a tempo that's maybe a little easier to digest right now. I know these chord changes are a lot, and you have to twist your fingers around in maybe some unfamiliar ways. So don't be afraid to kind of review that slow version a bunch until you can kind of ratchet the tempo up. If you think you're ready, let's go ahead and dive into that fast version at 160 beats per minute. All right, my friend, that is it for the chord changes to Sweet Georgia Brown. I hope that you get a lot out of these chord changes, and not just that, but that concept of the perpetually descending tritone to get us through those secondary dominant circle of fifth chord progressions. Once again, if that's kind of confusing to you, there are a few things that I would do. Look up the circle of fifths and kind of trace the root motion, just so you can see how that diagram perfectly outlines the chord changes to Sweet Georgia Brown. Secondly, look up the tritone, that augmented fourth or diminished fifth interval, and see how people resolve that in classical and jazz music. That's going to be a really key concept to understanding what I was talking about here today. If you haven't had a chance, go ahead and hit that subscribe button below, and also drop us a comment. Are tritones and circle of fifths chord progressions something you're familiar with and you think you can use in your own playing? Drop us a comment. I would really love to know your thoughts on that. Okay, music maker, that's it for the chord changes to Sweet Georgia Brown. Thanks so much for joining me here today. We'll catch you in the next video.